It's the evening of the 6th of April, 1830, in Salem, Massachusetts, at Gardner Pingree House, 128 Essex Street, a bespoke detached three-story property in one of the finest neighborhoods in the town. It was the home of the wealthy and successful 82-year-old Joseph White, who had made his fortune as a ship's captain, East Indies merchant, and trader. He was a widower with no children, but shared his house with his niece, Mary Beckford, who served as his housekeeper, Lydia Kimball, a domestic servant, and Benjamin White, a distant relative who worked as the house handyman. Beckford's daughter, also named Mary, had once been part of the household, but 3 years earlier she had married Joseph Knapp Jr., known to his friends as Joe, and she now lived with him on a farm 7 miles away in Wenham. He was previously the captain of a sailing vessel White owned and closely associated to the family. That night, the elderly captain went up to his bedroom at 9:40 p.m., which was a little later than usual. The events that later unfolded were found to be a crime driven by family arguments and resentments, a disavowed marriage, a lost will, money, and not so good old-fashioned New England greed. At 6 o'clock the following morning, Benjamin White was starting his usual daily routine when he noticed that a back window to the house on the ground floor was open and a plank was leaning against it. Knowing that Captain White kept gold coins in an iron chest in his room, and that there were many other valuables throughout the house, he feared that burglars had gained access. Worried, he at once alerted Lydia Kimball, and then climbed the elegant stairs to the second floor, where he found that the door to the captain's bedroom stood open. Cautiously, and with trepidation, peering inside, he saw White lying on his right-hand side, diagonally across the bed, and the sheets were in disarray. Something was very wrong, and approaching, he saw that the captain's left temple showed the signs of a crushing blow to the side of his head, although the skin was not broken. Blood had leaked onto the bedclothes from a number of wounds near his heart, and the body was already cold, with no signs of life. The iron chest positioned in a corner of the room, and its contents were untouched and intact, and nothing else had been disturbed or was out of place. Soon after the discovery of the body, Stephen White, the murdered man's nephew and a member of the Massachusetts legislature, sent for Samuel Johnson, a prominent Salem doctor, and William Ward, Captain White's clerk and business assistant. Ward made note of the plank at the open window, and near it he discovered 2 muddy footprints he believed had been made by the intruder, which could be important evidence. Ward carefully covered them with a milk pan to shield them from the drizzle that had begun to fall. Dr. Johnson's cursory examination revealed that death had occurred 3 to 4 hours earlier. The doctor performed an autopsy in the coroner's jury's presence. He carefully examined the corpse, stripping off the shirt and inserting probes into some of the stab wounds to determine their depth and direction, and counted 13 in all, attributed to the same weapon, which suggested that there had been a single murderer. There was no sign of spurting or spraying blood, which was interrupted to mean that the blow to the head had come first, either killing White or stunning him, thereby slowing his circulation. It was agreed that the skull fracture was due to a single severe blow from a cane or bludgeon, and that the chest wounds were caused by a short dagger. Stephen White gave the Salem Gazette permission to publish the autopsy findings. The newspaper wrote, "However revolting the subject may be, we have deemed it our duty to lay before our readers every particle of authentic information we can obtain respecting the horrible crime which has so shocked and alarmed our community." The possibility that more than one assailant might have been involved and were at large unsettled the town's residents. They armed themselves with knives, swords, and pistols, and there was a flurry of new locks and bolts being fitted to doors and windows. According to one account, Stephen White's brother-in-law, discovering that Stephen had inherited the bulk of the captain's estate, seized White by the collar, shook him violently in the presence of his family, and accused him of being the murderer. In an attempt to calm matters, the city fathers appointed a 27-man committee of vigilance. Its members were given the power to search any house and interrogate any individual. Members took an oath of secrecy and offered a $1,000 reward for information on the murder. But the investigation went nowhere. The committee was confronted on a scenario of too many subjects and too little evidence, and no one had made plaster casts of the incriminating footprints that Ward had carefully covered the morning of the murder. Since nothing had been stolen, the attacker's motive was unknown, but revenge was not out of the question. As many in Salem knew, Joseph White was not universally respected and liked. Known to be a bit of a domestic tyrant, he was given to changing his will at a whim and using his large fortune as a weapon to enforce his wishes. When his grandniece Mary announced her engagement to Joe Knapp, the old man declared Joe a fortune hunter, and when the marriage went forward without his consent, White disinherited Mary and fired Knapp. White had been a slave trader, and the ownership of slaves was abolished in Massachusetts in 1783, and the slave trade outlawed 5 years later. Yet White had boasted that he had no reluctance in selling any part of the human race. Some of the captain's ships had engaged in legitimate business, but many had sailed, loaded with tools and trinkets, to be traded in Africa for human cargo that was manacled and cramped into ghastly hulls, many of whom did not survive the voyage. Those who did were traded in the Caribbean for gold, more than enough to buy property, build a mansion, and fill an iron chest. Several days after the slaying, Stephen White received a letter from a jailer 70 miles away in New Bedford. The letter said an inmate called Hatch, who was a petty thief, claimed he had crucial information. Hatch, while visiting drinking establishments in February, had overheard two brothers of bad reputation, Richard and George Crowninshield, who favoured what was known as haunts of vice, discussing their intent to steal Joseph White's iron chest. The town's committee of vigilance brought Hatch in chains to testify before a Salem grand jury. On May the 5th, the jury charged Richard Crowninshield for murder. His brother George and 2 other men who were with him at the time were charged with aiding and abetting the crime. On May the 14th, Joseph Knapp Sr., the father of the man who had married White's disinherited grandniece, received a letter from Belfast in Maine. It demanded the sum of $350 and threatened disclosure about the murder, and that it would be ruinous if this was not promptly paid by the 22nd of the month. It was signed Charles Grant. Knapp Sr. did not know the writer and showed it to his son, who offered the view that it was a load of rubbish and suggested it be shown to the Committee of Vigilance. When they found out about the letter, in an attempt to flush out the truth, they sent $50 anonymously to Grant, care of his local post office, with a promise of more to come. A man was dispatched to apprehend whoever collected the money. The person who turned up was an ex-convict named John Palmer, and he was detained and questioned as a possible accessory to murder. His story was an interesting one. as he knew who had killed Captain White and why they did it. He was promised immunity from prosecution in exchange for his statement and realized that it was advisable in order to prove his innocence. It went that during a visit to the Crowninshield family home, Palmer had overheard George telling Richard that Frank Knapp, one of Joseph Knapp Sr.'s sons, wanted to kill Captain White, and that Joe Jr., Frank's brother, would pay them $1,000 to commit the deed. Several different ways of committing the act had been discussed, and it was finally decided that it had to be done at night. On May the 2nd, the Crowninshield brothers were arrested, but they kept quiet about the murder plot because they couldn't implicate the Knapps in the crime without incriminating themselves. 3 days later, a jury indicted Richard Crowninshield for murder, and his brother was charged with abetting the crime. Palmer refused to have any involvement, even though he had been offered a small cut, and when he later heard about the murder, he wrote to Joseph Knapp Jr. to blackmail him about it, but said he instead accidentally addressed the letter to his father, Joseph Knapp Sr. The Knapp brothers were subsequently arrested and charged with being accessories to murder and sent to the Salem prison, their cells not far from those occupied by the Crowninshields. Palmer was detained as a witness. He also gave the authorities additional information about the Crowninshields' criminal careers, which enabled them to recover a quantity of stolen property concealed in their barn. At first, Richard Crowninshield was certain that he would be found innocent, that is, until the end of May. Joseph Knapp's pastor, Reverend Coleman, visited him in jail and got Knapp to provide a written 9-page confession to the crime in exchange for immunity. Legally, a confession that induces or promises a reward is not admissible in court because it is deemed not voluntary, since the confessor will usually say whatever is required. Joseph Knapp had been in prison for 3 days when he made this confession, which goes as follows. I knew that Mr. White had made out a will in which he gave my mother-in-law, Mrs. Beckford, a legacy of $15,000. According to my understanding of the law, which I have since learned was erroneous, I believe she would get $200,000 if no will was found. I therefore decided to steal the will and have Mr. White assassinated. 4 days before the murder, I was in Mr. White's bedroom, procuring the key to his iron chest. I took his will and carried it home, burning it several days later. My brother Frank negotiated with Richard Crowninshield, who agreed to do the deed for $1,000. The night of April the 6th was finally decided upon, and I persuaded my mother-in-law to spend a few days with my wife at Wenham. On the 6th, I visited Mr. White's home, to which I always had access, and unfastened the ground floor window at the back of the house. That day, Crowninshield showed me the bludgeon and dagger with which the murder was to be committed. Crowninshield and my brother Frank met at 10 o'clock that night by appointment and proceeded to a spot where they could observe the movements in White's mansion. The lights in the house were extinguished, and shortly afterwards, the hired assassin, Richard and George Crowninshield, crept into the rear yard through the garden gate and placed a plank against the house, entered the unlocked window, and crept upstairs to White's bedroom to murder him. Crowninshield swung his bludgeon and struck White on the left temple, probably killing him instantly. But, to be certain, he lowered the bedclothes and stabbed him repeatedly in the region of the heart. Richard Crowninshield, who had assumed an air of indifference ever since his arrest, collapsed when informed of Knapp's confession. Officers later recovered the bludgeon, hidden under some steps at a meeting house, as described by Knapp. Joe and Frank Knapp had discussed how to commit the murder. They considered ambushing White on a road or attacking him in his house. Frank had suggested hiring Richard and George Crowninshield, who the Knapp brothers had known for many years. After several meetings, the Knapps and the Crowninshields gathered at Salem Common on April the 2nd to finalise the plan. Richard Crowninshield had brought the tools he planned to use. Using his skills, he had manufactured one of the murder weapons, a club. It was made from hardwood and was about 24 inches long. The dagger had a blade about 5 inches in length and sharpened on both edges, tapering to a point. The 9-page confession was signed by Knapp and included references to explain that he believed if Captain White died without a legal will, his fortune would be divided among his close relatives, giving Mary Beckford, Knapp's mother-in-law, a considerable fortune. To this end, he had managed to open Captain White's iron chest 4 days before the murder and stole what he thought to be the legal will. The genuine one, favoured his nephew, Stephen, was safely locked up in the family solicitor's office. The confession pointed to Richard Crowninshield as the principal perpetrator of the crime, so he would hang. On June the 15th, at 2 in the afternoon, a jailer found his body hanging by its neck from 2 silk handkerchiefs tied to the bars of his cell window. He left 2 farewell letters in the cell, one addressed to his father and one to his brother George, in which he acknowledged that he had led a wicked life and said he felt hopeless about his predicament and he wanted to warn all young people to tread a different path. The prosecution in the White case faced a quandary. The main accused had committed suicide, and Joe Knapp was refusing to testify and withdrew his confession so as not to implicate his brother. Both the accused men had chosen to be tried separately, and the first to come to trial was that of Frank Knapp, which began on August the 3rd. With Richard Crowninshield dead, the judge mentioned that there is no refuge from confession but suicide, and suicide is confession. The prosecution famously said it was their intention to establish Frank Knapp as a principal rather than as an accessory. Several witnesses testified on the night in question they had seen a man wearing a cloak and a cap, such as Frank often wore, on Brown Street behind the White property, and it was argued that Frank was there to give direct aid to the murderer and was therefore a prime actor. The jury deliberated for many hours before announcing that their opinions were divided, so the judge declared a mistrial. The case was scheduled to be retried 2 days later. In the time between the 2 trials, the new jury would have read newspaper accounts of the first hearing, as well as to the heavy criticism for failure to convict. The second trial began on August the 14th and was packed with onlookers. The second jury listened intently to the prosecution's dramatic recreation of the crime. The defense put up a strong argument, but after 5 hours of deliberation, the jury accepted that Frank Knapp was an instigator of the crime and was present the night of the murder to give direct aid to the Crowninshields and was, therefore, the principal to the crime, and Joseph was the accessory. The brothers had believed that if Captain White died without a will, his estate would pass down to White's niece, Mary Beckford, who was the wife of Joseph Knapp. 6 days later, Frank Knapp had been found guilty and was sentenced to death. On September the 28th, before a crowd of thousands, he was hanged in front of Salem prison. His brother Joseph, who was tried and convicted in November, met the same fate 3 months later. George Crowninshield, the remaining conspirator, had spent the night of the murder with two ladies of the evening, who provided him with an alibi, and he was released. Some records say that the Knapp brothers were buried in unmarked graves in the Howard Street Cemetery, the same location where their victim, Captain White, is also buried.